Hey folks, welcome to week 9 of Visual Design. We are back and we are now fully online, as you well know. So today we are going to begin working with Adobe Illustrator. As you probably remember, where we left off was we had finished up with Adobe Photoshop. We did our project, our crime noir poster in Adobe Photoshop, of which you guys all did a fabulous job. They were all wonderful. And so now we're going to move on to a new piece of software. So the material, of course, is from week 6 because we were a little behind in the class, but we're actually in week 9. Anyway, it'll become clear as you go along, and I've actually updated it on the syllabus I'm going to be showing you here on the screen. All right, so let's get rolling. So open up Adobe Illustrator, or at least follow along with what I'm doing, and then you guys can practice on your own. Okay, so first of all, what is the major difference between Adobe Photoshop and Adobe Illustrator? So the number one thing to understand is that Adobe Photoshop is a pixel-based piece of software. We talked about this before. Thousands of colored grains of sand. You know that. I've used that analogy a gazillion times by now. And Illustrator, by contrast, is a vector piece of software. Instead of using pixels to create imagery, Illustrator uses geometry to create imagery. Now, if you took a geometry class in high school and you didn't like it, you can stop twitching. We're not actually doing geometry. We are instead just using the program, but in the background of Illustrator is some magical geometry, which helps us make shapes and graphics that are non-resolution dependent. What does that mean? Well, the easiest way to demonstrate that is to simply put an object on screen in Illustrator, and I'm just going to make a square here really simply. And then we'll go back and go over all the tools, all the palettes, or at least the majority of the palettes, how the workspace works, and how to make things in a minute. But first I just want to sort of demonstrate the difference. Now you know that in Photoshop, if we were to keep zooming in on an object, it would become pixelated because it is resolution dependent, and the closer you get to an object, or the bigger that it gets, the blurrier it gets. However, here in the world of Illustrator, we don't have that problem. So here we are zoomed in at, let's see, 12,750%. That's zoomed in pretty far. And notice how crisp and clean the black line is, how crisp and clean the red line is, separating the stroke from the fill here. So the reason is because as we zoom in, that sort of magic geometry I talked to you about in the back is simply recalibrating the piece and making it stay clear and crisp at all times, so it is not at all resolution dependent. So what that means is that objects you put into Illustrator are scalable, meaning that they would look just as good at regular size as they would at really tiny size, as they would at really enormous size. So no matter how big or small you make something, it keeps its resolution, it still looks beautiful. So pretty straightforward. So that's really the basics. Now, in terms of what is Illustrator good for, because it's a vector graphics program, well, it does a particularly good job with regard to logos and graphics and typography. Those three objects are really best suited to Adobe Illustrator. Anything that requires crisp and clean lines, flat, beautiful colors, and must be scalable. If you think about it, a logo design has to appear in a variety of different places. Including somebody's business card where it's really small, somebody's flyers or brochures where it's sort of medium size, on somebody's website where it's an entirely different resolution, and maybe on the side of a van or a billboard where it's really huge, and so it has to be scalable. So those are things that Illustrator is commonly used for. And of course, as the name implies, Illustrator is good for illustrations, things like these rockets here, which are actual drawings of things. Now, these are either graphical and iconic like this, or sort of flat like that, or a little more detailed, such as this one. And of course, you can do even more detailed illustrations in Illustrator, depending on how skilled you are with the software. Okay, so now that we understand that, let's talk about the basics. So here is the workspace. Now, before we get started, we want to make sure that we're using the same workspace. So just like in Photoshop, you're going to go up to the File menu and go over to Window, then go down to Workspace and choose Essentials. Essentials is usually a good place to start with most of the programs. Now, Essentials gives you a set of palettes over here that you will need, as well as the standard two-column toolbar. And you can open up a new document any size you want simply by going to File and New, and then it gives you the new document window. Now, you might be noticing so far that, hey, this kind of looks like Photoshop. There's a lot of tools and functionality that are similar or work exactly the same. And so the nice thing about some of these Adobe products, particularly between Photoshop and Illustrator, is that once you've learned one, you pretty much know 50% of the other one already, and so the learning curve is smaller. So this new document pop-up menu here is pretty much exactly the same as it is in Photoshop. You can choose from a variety of categories, some presets, and you can customize it over here. So anyway, once you do that, you've got yourself a document. Let's talk about the various areas in which we will work. Okay, so the first item of interest is, of course, the toolbox on the left here. Now again, pretty similar to Photoshop. Different tools, naturally, because it does different things, but some of the tools might look familiar to you. This is the 2-column version, which I tend to like because it's easier to understand where everything is. But of course, if you want the thinner version, you can hit the little double baby arrows here and go down to the thinner 1-column version of the toolbox, which might fit better on your laptop, but it's up to you. All right, so 2 columns works nicely. There's a variety of tools. We're not going to go through every single tool, naturally, but we'll get through a bunch of them just to show you what some of them do. It starts out at the top here with the black selection arrow. Now, I'm only pointing that one out here because sort of unlike Photoshop, Illustrator has sort of a default state that you want to get back to when you're not drawing or selecting things, and the black selection arrow, or the selection tool, as it's called, is the key to doing that. So pretty much whenever you are done doing anything in Illustrator, you want to go back to the black selection tool, and then we'll do something that's called clicking off, which is where you basically shut things off by clicking in some dead space, like this gray area here. And I'll demonstrate that more as we go along. Okay, so those are the tools. In the middle is, of course, your workspace, and this here is your document or your artboard. Now, unlike Photoshop, where the artboard that you're working on is more of a frame, and if you remember in Photoshop, the objects that appear on the screen as you move them off frame sort of go behind it, and you can't see them. Here in Illustrator, it doesn't work that way. In fact, if I grab the magnifying glass tool and back it up a little bit, you can see that it functions mostly as a piece of paper. So if you imagine it as a digital piece of paper, that's sort of your best analogy. And the workspace that is provided to you in Illustrator is fairly large. Now, unlike Photoshop, where it's a frame, you can not only put objects on your piece of paper, but you can also put objects off of your piece of paper out here in this gray space, which is referred to as the scratch space. So this allows you to put additional objects out here for later use, and whenever you want to bring them back onto the paper, you can simply pick them up and do that. So meaning in Illustrator, it's not just your artboard that is useful, it is all the area around the artboard. Now, how much area are we talking about? Well, it's a lot of area. So if we zoom back, we can see how much available space there is to work in. And that's it. So there's our piece of paper. Which, by the way, this piece of paper I'm working with is 16 by 9 inches. And so all this dark gray area is scratch space, which means two things. I can not only put a ton of objects out here, but I could also make a ton of pieces of paper. So I'll show you how to do that later on. You can make additional artboards. And so the workspace is pretty vast in Photoshop. Okay, so let's zoom back in here and then we'll keep moving. Okay, next at the bottom of the workspace, you're going to find some useful information, such as the zoom ratio. Here I am zoomed in at 58.64%. I can use the pull up menu and just pick some variety of preset zooms if I would like. Of course, you can use the magnifying glass, just like you did in Photoshop, to zoom in and out. That also works. We only have one artboard here, but if you had multiple artboards, you could access them by going to this pull-down menu, and they're numbered 1, 2, 3, 4, and so on and so forth. And of course, there is the scroll bars on the bottom and the right side that allows you to scroll around. And naturally, if you need to scroll around, otherwise you can grab the hand tool, just like in Photoshop, and sort of move your way around the document that way. Okay, next part of this program that we need to check out are the palettes. Now the palettes are in the exact same spot and they function the exact same way as the ones in Photoshop. So you already know this, so I don't have to tell you about the tabs. I don't have to tell you about moving from different palettes by simply clicking on them. And I have to tell you about flyout palettes like this because they all did the same thing in Photoshop. Now, of course, there's a select bunch of palettes here because we are in the Essentials workspace. But there are more palettes that are not visible, some of which you might find useful, some of which you might never use. And similar to Photoshop, there's a ton of palettes. So if you go to the Window menu, right where we found Workspace, you'll see that these are all the available palettes in Illustrator. There's a lot of them, and then there's some more. So if you go to Type, you'll see that anything regarding typography, there's a whole bunch of other palettes. So there's a lot of palettes, and they all have different purposes. They do different things, and are generally geared towards different types of functionality. But we're going to go over some of the basic ones as we move along here. Now, if you've moved things around and you have maybe turned off certain palettes, or you pick things up and move them, like if I were to move this guy over here and move this guy over here, you just generally make a mess. You can always go back to Window, go back to Workspace, and go down to Reset Essentials. And that'll just put things back the way we had them, right? Window, Workspace, Essentials, and we're pretty much ready to rock and roll. Okay, so moving on. Now, what about making things in Illustrator? Well, first things first, let's go down to some of those making tools. The first one to start with is the Shape tool. Now, it's not completely at the top. It's the third tool down on the left, and it usually starts out with the Rectangle tool. And this here is a collection of geometric shapes you are familiar with. The first one, of course, being the rectangle, and then if you click and hold down on that tool, you'll see that there is a rectangle tool, which of course also makes squares, an ellipse tool, which also makes circles, a polygon tool, which also makes a variety of multi-sided polygons, such as pentagons, octagons, and so on, the star tool, which makes multiple pointed stars, and a line segment tool. Now, of course, I did mention that Photoshop works with sort of magic geometry, as it were. This, of course, should be familiar because if you took geometry, you know a lot of these shapes are things that are covered in geometry. So we're going to start by making some shapes just to sort of show how things work. Now, Illustrator has recently been sort of overhauled in that even though there are a bunch of palettes to pick from, they have added a new and improved properties palette. Which I like to refer to as sort of a golf caddy palette. Basically what it means is that the properties palette will change and give you the tools that it thinks you need based on what is on the workspace. Adobe is working in this direction with a lot of their software. If you've used Adobe Spark online, you know that the entire program works that way. Well, here in Illustrator, they've been testing it out with the properties palette, and we'll see how that goes. All right, so anywho, I am going to take a rectangle and simply click with the mouse and drag out a rectangle. Now, once you are dragging something out, as long as you are keeping the mouse button pushed down, you'll see that it is live, and you can reshape it however you want. Thin horizontal rectangle, thin vertical rectangle, big rectangle, little tiny rectangle, and so on and so forth. You'll also notice that as I'm moving it around, sometimes a purple line will pop up. Those are your smart guides that gives you some clues as to what's going on in terms of spatial relationships. And you'll also see in the lower right corner here that as I'm moving around the rectangle, it is keeping track of the width and the height of the rectangle I am drawing, which can be helpful. Now, if you want to make a perfect square, you just need to simply hold down the Shift key at the same time that you are drawing the rectangle, and it will force it to be a perfect square. And then again, if you want it to be a rectangle, just let go of the Shift key, and then it becomes more malleable. Okay, so once you have made it to roughly the size you want it to be, you can let go of the mouse button, and then it sort of locks it in place. Now, even though it is locked in place, you will be able to change it and make alterations to it. Now, I did mention that when you're done doing anything in Illustrator, you should go back to the black selection arrow up here in the upper left corner. So we do that. It shuts off the rectangle tool, and now it allows us to pick up the rectangle and move it around, which we can do here. Now we'll talk about some of the tools that are inherent in all of the shapes right now. So with the rectangle selected, and let's talk about active and non-active, sort of selected and not selected. So that black rectangle, that black selection arrow allows you to choose an object, and then if you want the object to not be chosen or to be inactive, you simply click off into some dead space, either the white paper or the gray space, and it shuts off the tool. So now you'll see that the rectangle is just sort of locked in place, which is pretty great, right? Now, if you click on the object with the black selection arrow again, like that, it activates it, turns it back on again. Now, how do we know it's active? Well, this thing has popped up around it, this blue collection of controls. It's referred to as a bounding box. Now, you've heard that term before. We used it in Photoshop when we were transforming things in Photoshop. Remember Command-T in Photoshop turned on the bounding box? So this is also a bounding box. It's a little more elaborate than the one in Photoshop, and I'll show you what it does. So the first thing it does is there is a collection of anchors which are in the upper right corner, upper left corner, lower right corner, as well as the four sides of the object. These anchor points, if you hover over them, you'll see that your cursor will go from a black arrow and it will become a bunch of different other types of arrows. So for example, if I hover over this anchor point, it becomes a double-sided arrow. And then if I click and drag, I can change the height of my rectangle. Do it again. If I hover over a corner anchor point, it becomes a double-sided arrow as well, but now it's an angled one. I can pick that up and drag and resize it this way. And if I want to resize it but maintain the width and height ratio, I can simply hold down the Shift key, click and drag, and you'll notice that I can't squish it anymore. I can only make it larger or smaller. Okay, works with the sides as well. Grab this anchor tool, bring it in, bring it back out again, so on and so forth. So that's one thing the bounding box does. The second thing the bounding box does, which I already showed you earlier, is if you bring your black arrow to the middle of the object or somewhere inside the object, I can pick it up and just move it. Just literally relocate it. So that's easy enough. So that's the second thing that it does. The third thing that it does is if I bring my cursor outside of the corner the corner anchor point, you'll see that it becomes a curved double-sided arrow, which is now telling me I can rotate the object. So now if I click and spin, I can rotate the object. Whee! See, I'm spinning it around. And of course, if I let it go at any point, it's now angled the way I wanted it to be. Okay, now if I want to rotate it at a set of sort of delineated angles, I can hold down the Shift key while rotating it, and it will rotate every 45 degrees. Again, back to the geometry again, and you'll see that it's showing you the degrees right there as I am rotating it. But if you want to just free-form rotate it, you can click it without the Shift key and then just spin it around. Okay, now Illustrator handles as many undos as you could possibly want, so Command or Control Z will just take you backwards. So if I did rotate it and then decide, you know what, I really want it rotated after all, I can just Command Z or Control Z and go back. So that's easy. Okay, so that's the third thing the bounding box does. Resizes it, allows you to move the object, allows you to rotate the object. There is one last thing the bounding box does. It allows you to round the corners. Now, this functionality is not on every single shape, but it is available on some of the shapes. So these little circles here in the corners, right, that are a little further into the corners, you'll notice if I hover over them, my cursor changes yet again. And if I click on them and pull inwards, notice that the corners are becoming rounded. And I can keep pulling inwards until it stops, and that's as far as it would go. And then if I want to get rid of the rounded corners, I can again grab those circles and just simply go back in the other direction until you get back to your points. And so it's fully adjustable that way. In and then back out again. Pretty great, right? Okay, so those are the things that the bounding box does. Move, resize, rotate, and round corners. So it really allows you to change the way the shapes are functioning. Okay, now let's try that out with some other shapes. So I'm going to shrink down this rectangle and put it over here. And then I'm going to go back to my shape tools and grab an elliptical tool and click and drag out an ellipse. And very similarly, I can make a thin ellipse, tall, flat. If I hold down the Shift key, I can make a circle, a perfect circle. And then when I let go of it, it becomes a finished shape. And again, once I'm done with it, go back to the black selection arrow. And now I can either click off and deactivate it, or I can click on and pick it up and move it. I can resize it I can rotate it, right? So all of that works great. Now, of course, you'll notice that I can't round the corners because, well, they're already rounded. However, if I grab this ball right here, which sticks out of the top of the circle, and then click that, I can turn it from a circle into a Pac-Man. Now, if you don't get that reference, you don't know what the video game is. But basically, I can make it look like a pie chart, right? So I can grab these circles and put it back together like this. I can open it up this way. I can grab this one and bring it back again and reconnect them. Make it a slice as opposed to the pie itself. And go back to making it a circle. So that's the functionality that's available on a circle that you don't get on the rectangle or the square, is you can do this with it, which is pretty great. Okay, so again, shrink this guy down, bring it over here, and then we'll grab another one. So now we're going to grab the polygon tool. Now the polygon tool is interesting because as you click and drag that out, you'll notice that this is the default polygon, right? It has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 sides. But now what if I want my polygon to have more or less sides? Well, while I am drawing it, while it is still active and I haven't let go of the mouse yet, the arrow keys on your keyboard, which of course are in the lower right corner of your keyboard, the up and down arrows, if I hit the up arrow, I added a side. So now it has 7 sides. Add another side, now it's an octagon. Add another side, now it's a nonagon, I guess. I don't know, I'm making that up. A tonagon, I don't know. Now, if I keep pushing the down arrow, you'll see that it'll remove sides until it becomes a pentagon, which is 5 sides, or a square, because a square is technically a hexagon. And then one more time, and you get to the triangle. You were probably wondering, where is the triangle? I don't see the triangle anywhere. Well, that's where it is. So if you remove enough sides, you eventually get down to 3 sides, and that becomes your triangle. And similarly to the other shapes, if I hold down the Shift key, it will lock it in place to be sort of a perfect triangle. Then if I let go of the Shift key, I can spin it around. And then once you're done, you let go, and it puts it in its place. And then again, remember, you always go back to the black selection arrow. And then if I want to deactivate it, I click here. Or if I want to reactivate it, I click here. Now, again, with the bounding box, there is some functionality on the triangle that isn't available anywhere else. You can resize it, right? We know that already. I can rotate it by coming out here and doing this. I can also grab one of these circles here and round the corners, just like I could with the square, so that's fun. But also, if I grab this diamond, I can add or subtract more sides while it is already drawn. So now I can go to a pentagon, or I can go to a 6-sided hexagon, an octagon, so on and so forth. So it's the little diamond on the side allows you to make those changes. And then even after I've turned it from a triangle to a pentagon, I can go back to these circles and get rid of the rounded edges. So all of these blue function buttons or function shapes of the bounding box all do something. So definitely sort of play around with them and see what you can do. Okay, so that is the hexagon. And then we're going to go down to the star, which works exactly like the hexagon. Click and drag. You start out with a typical 5-sided star, but while it's still active, if I go down on the arrow key, I eliminate points, and if I go up on the arrow key, I can add points. And then once I'm done with it, I can let go and lock it into place. Again, back to your black selection arrow to activate or deactivate, and then there you go. Now, interestingly, the star does not have a ton of functionality. You cannot round the corners. You cannot add or subtract sides after it's made. You can just resize it and rotate it. So it seems to have limited functionality compared to the hexagon. I imagine that will change in the future. They'll get around to that. Okay, so those are the basic shapes, right? Rectangle or square, ellipse or circle, hexagon of a variety of different sizes, which also gets you the triangle, and multi-point stars. All right, so what I want you guys to do is sort of play around with the shape tools and see what you can make for a little while. Do that, and then I'll have another video up soon, which will go over some more of the functionality.